So frontier incidence is armed attack, and with armed attacks, this is the topic of my research. So first of all, because not everybody here from legal background, and I will explain the basics. Under the UN Charter, we have Article 2.4, which said that aggression is always illegal. States cannot solve their problems by the use of force. And Article 51 is an exception, which says when the state is faced with an armed attack, then it has the right to act in self-defense. Now, as we can see in Article 2.4, we have the term aggression. In Article 51, we have the term armed attack. So there is a force gap. Not every type of aggression, while every type of aggression will be illegal, not every type of aggression will be considered an armed attack and therefore trigger the right to self-defense. So, now let's start. So in the case of the judgment of Nicaragua versus United States given by the ICJ, this topic of the force gap has been discussed, and several things has been said. So first of all, it has been said that it will be necessary to distinguish most grave forms of use of force from the less grave forms. How do we distinguish them? We run them under the scale and effects test. It's a test that is set to see if an act of aggression constitutes an armed attack and therefore grants the state a right to act in self-defense. And afterwards, the judgment says specifically that there are graver forms of use of force and there are mere frontier incidents. And this judgment has been understood to set that frontier incidents are outside the scope of an armed attack. They will never qualify as armed attacks. We can see later that in the Eritrea-Ethiopia Claims Commission, several things have been said that are in the same spirit, that small skirmishes, small invasions will not constitute an armed attack. They are mere frontier incidents. Now, this kind of differentiation between armed attacks and frontier incidents is not universally accepted. There are two camps, basically. There's the inclusion camp and the exclusion camp. The scholars, the legal scholars who are in favor of inclusion, they're saying that we should check every frontier incident on its own merits and check them under the scale and effects test, and then see, because there are frontier incidents and there are frontier incidents. Some may be minor, but other might be severe enough. The exclusion camp, their position is that since frontier incidents are the most common form of use of force between states, if we will allow them to go under the scale and effects test, what we will get is an uncontrollable escalation of violence. It will create global instability because frontier incidents do happen a lot. The border is a very busy place, a lot of military presence, and things do happen. So, but first let's talk about what are exactly frontier incidents, because we don't have an exact definition in international law. The definition is quite geographical, actually. There are incidents, use of force, that happen next to the border. So it can be attacked by a single person trying to cross the border, raiders damaging property, animals crossing the border. These are all from the Iran-Iraq ceasefire agreement. So we can see really minor things, stealing cattle, or someone accidentally discharging a weapon while cleaning it. These are frontier incidents. But we have other forms of use of force which also constitute frontier incidents, and they might challenge the perception that frontier incidents are always minor. So we have kidnapping of soldiers or civilians. When you think about the 2006 Lebanon War, it started with a frontier incident. Yeah. It started with Hezbollah militants ambushing a unit. They had explosive devices. They kidnapped soldiers, and then the entire war, the explanation that Israel gave for its right to self-defense was that it had to defend itself, and its mission is to make sure that those soldiers return back home. And we can see it even in the 2014 Gaza war, even though that's not a sterile case, that it started with the Shuvu Achim operation. 3 young boys were kidnapped, and Israel started an operation to try and retrieve them. We didn't know at that time that they were not alive at that point, but it did start the war. Now, maybe the 2014 war is not as good of a case, because the thing that really set ongoing the armed conflict was actually the tunnels. And that leads me to the next point. The digging of combat tunnels. The digging of combat tunnels are frontier incidents. There is a great book by Daphne Richmond-Brack that deals with it. And they have been around here for a long time. There are some that in today, like in Syria, they're in use too, but this is more relevant in the use in bello sort of approach. But when we see the chain of tunnels under Gaza, which actually started the 2014 Gaza war, then you see that it was really perceived to be an armed attack. When you see states that responded to Israel's claim of self-defense, we have Obama, who said that Israel has the right to defend itself from threats both above the ground and underground. Similar statements were made by the UK, by different states from the European Union. Now, in the beginning, there was kind of, not by all, of course, but there was a sentiment by state that Israel does have a right to operate. It does operate in self-defense, and then there was a lot of criticism about disproportionality. But the actual claim that the tunnel threat, as they would call give rise to a claim of self-defense, and that they are an armed attack, got some kind of acknowledgement. Now, the next thing that we have here, border riots. Now, this is the most provocative example. When we look at the March of Return, now I'm not saying that this is an armed attack, but this is a frontier incident that challenges the traditional perception that we have of frontier incidents. There are attacks of mixed population, both militants and civilians. They happen during every weekend over the course of a year. It has both from the civilian part of things, weddings and reading nights and very civilian kind of activities. But we also have people who are trying to cross the fence and claims that they're trying to arrange a mass breaching of it and get to Israeli kibbutzim in the Gaza envelope. There are kites and balloons which are attached with bombs, creating mass fires. So it's a very complicated event. Now, these all three examples here that are all from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, they're problematic. They're problematic in the sense that when you take outside Israel and Lebanon, which are both states, obviously, then you have Israel and Gaza. And the status of Israel and Gaza is a complicated one. Legal scholars, people, states have different opinions about the classification of this conflict. Some people say that we shouldn't even talk about Israel's right to self-defense because Israel is occupying Gaza. Israel is claiming that we shouldn't talk about self-defense because there is a continuous armed conflict between Israel and Gaza. So, I think that this is sort of a weak point of the research of the article. So what I'm asking you to do is sort of to frame the discussion, to assume, because the research is not about the status of Gaza and Israel, to assume that Israel does have to prove self-defense, that we are in an ad bellum situation. And from the other side of it, when we're trying to see if there's an armed attack, to disregard the state non-state differentiation. My sort of observation here is, and it has, of course, it's backed by research and examples from literature, is that if it's a state or a non-state is relevant for the second stage. We're at the first stage. At the first stage, you try to see if an armed attack has taken place. If you consider what happened to be an armed attack, then you reach to the second stage to understand whether you have a right to self-defense. Some people may say that if the attack was carried by a non-state, maybe you don't have a right to use force in self-defense. But we are not at this stage. We're just trying to understand if the use of force that has happened can be considered an armed attack, or if it's a mere frontier incident, if it's just an aggression that falls short from the threshold of armed attack. So, what I'm suggesting is a preliminary test. I want to challenge the dichotomy of inclusion or exclusion. I do understand the sense and the logic in both arguments. I mean, we don't want to see an escalation of violence. We don't want every minor frontier incidents to start being examined whether it's an armed attack or not. But on the other side, if you exclude completely frontier incidents from the scope of armed attacks, that does not make a good, it doesn't represent reality actually, because as we have seen, states do sometimes see frontier incidents as armed attacks, and frontier incidents can be quite grave. So what I'm offering is a test that takes into consideration the different criteria and characteristics that we've seen in the more challenging frontier incidents examples before, and that if a specific incident will satisfy those requirements in a quite flexible way, it doesn't have to tick all boxes, of course, then it can go under the scale and effects test and be tested to see whether it is indeed an armed attack. So the first criteria will be that of intent. If we're looking at the examples of, for example, the Lebanon War, it was intentional rather than someone acting rogue or something that happened by mistake, like a discharge. It was a well-planned operation. Lebanon, by means of the Hezbollah, planned to set an armed attack. It wasn't just a brigade acting on its own mind. And when we think about the next example about the tunnels, these are combat tunnels designed for that purpose. We have many sort of statements by Hamas officials claiming exactly so. Now, when we look at the Gaza protest, then it becomes much more complicated because it's mixed. The intention is not completely there. It's a civilian protest mixed with some militant activity too. So there, the intent is not complete, and we'll talk about it more later. Now, the second criteria, military character of events. When you think about the three events, they definitely have a military character. And when you think about, for example, the tunnels, there is a big difference between combat tunnels used for military purposes than, let's say, smuggling tunnels. If you think about the tunnels dug between Mexico and the United States, those are by no means tunnels with a military character. They're used maybe for criminal activity, but not military activity. And when you think about the kidnapping of soldiers, civilians, it's different. There's a difference if you kidnap a soldier for the purpose of ransom, for example, or if you do so to get some kind of political leverage.
Isn't that intent? Just a political? Yeah. Isn't that the intent?
Well, not exactly, because you can do something intentional. For example, digging a tunnel. You do so because you want to smuggle products, so but it's not military.
Right.
The intent should be military. I think maybe it's a good remark. They can sort of combine those two. So there is intent, but it should also be for a military purpose, because intent can be also for a civilian, although criminal purpose. Now, the next criteria, the complexity, incapacity to solve an issue on the spot. This is derived from Dinstein's idea. He's talking about that sometimes in frontier incidents you can just solve the case on the spot. If you follow the unit's right of self-defense. If a unit is confronted with another unit, think about the frontier incidents where two patrolling units sort of come across one each other, a fight begins, and violence happens. So the attacked unit can just protect its own life, can act in self-defense, but after the fight has ended between the two units, the frontier incident has ended. Now, when you think about tunnels, the incident is not solved completely until the tunnel has been destructed. And some experts say that it should be destructed from both ends, that it's not enough to simply, let's say, pour concrete or blow it on your side of the fence. The threat will linger as long as the tunnel exists. When you talk about kidnapped soldiers, it's not the exact moment of the kidnap that makes the frontier incident complete. While the soldier is still out there, then the state has to deal with it, has to think of a strategy of what to do. And with Israel, we see it massively. I mean, it controls the public debate here. When you talk about the Great March of Return, the fires, the environmental damage, there's a lot to deal with it. You can't just solve it on the spot. You have some repercussions, you have a complex event. Now, the last criteria, accumulation of incidents, this comes from the oil platforms case. When it has been acknowledged by some means, it's not under consensus, but it has some basis in international law, that few smaller incidents can accumulate and form an armed attack. So when we look at the tunnels, for example, if Israel would have revealed one tunnel, I don't think that Israel would have claimed or could have claimed that this is an armed attack. It would have dealt with that tunnel. But when we discover a dozen tunnels, then you have a real problem. When you have the March of Return, if Israel would have confronted one protest, I think it was quite clear that it needs to sort of deal with it. It becomes more complicated when you have such protests every single week. So there is sort of an accumulative essence to it, and accumulative quality to it.
What about inflicted damage? I mean, the whole issue of damage which may be inflicted by...
So that's obviously important, but I think that comes to play later in the scale and effects test. So I leave it there because.
Okay. Thanks.
But yeah, of course you're right, and I think that the damage has something to do with the complexity. Even though that when you think of a kidnapped soldier, there's not a lot of actual damage done to actual life. You can think about a frontier incident when a bullet is shot and someone gets killed, and it will not be acknowledged as an armed attack, rather than a kidnapped soldier. So the application of the preliminary test, as I said, it's quite, it's not a strict test, it's flexible, and you don't have to tick all boxes. For example, intention is often very difficult to prove. If you don't have intention, it doesn't mean that it's not an armed attack for sure. But if you can prove intention, that will help you in the test. So let's see the different the application of it. So when we look at the 2006 Lebanon War, we see that we have the element of intention. We have it was intentional. We definitely have the element of complexity. It was a very complex event that Israel had to deal with far after the moment of the kidnapping. It is of a military character, but what it's not of an accumulative nature, right? It was a single event. But nevertheless, I think that this sort of the border incident that started the Lebanon War is indeed entitled to go under the scale and effect test, and it has been acknowledged by various legal scholars as an armed attack. Second example, the tunnel network under Gaza. So here too, we have a complex event with a military character. There is an intention, and there is also an accumulation because we have various tunnels. When you look at the Great March of Return now, I think that this incident does not qualify to go under the scale and effects test. And I think that this is due to the importance of the military character of events factor and the intention. So I think that the sort of interplay that you make here, that is the more that you consider the Great March of Return to be a civilian event, the more you will not think of it as a good candidate to go under the scales and effect test. Now we see different approaches here, right? Because when you read the judgment of Yesh Din, and which basically takes the state's position, you might consider it to be more of a military character. If you read the UN's report, then you may think of it more as a civilian character. But even the military character here is probably the most important criteria. And therefore I think that this is an example for a frontier incident that might be complex and might be untraditional, but still it lacks the necessary factors to go through the preliminary test and go there under the scale and effect test. So that's it for the presentation. Now, this research is currently under review. It does have problems that I'm aware of and trying to think how to resolve. The thing that bothers me the most personally is that the examples here from the Israeli-Arab conflict, and I think that this is very limiting. It can be viewed as a very private, specific territory, which is hard to get to conclusions about other cases. It's also a very debated topic. People have different opinions. It's not sterile. Some people think about it as occupations, others as so it's messy. It's problematic. And while I have found many other cases where states have said that frontier incidents did constitute an armed attack, I think that what's unique about our conflict is that it's very much in the middle of the public debate. States comment on it. There are discussions in the UN about it, and thus it gives me the second part of the equation, and that's whether the world find the claim to be right or wrong. So I had Cambodia and Thailand and Pakistan and other states claiming that frontier incidents have been considered armed attacks, but then there is no discussion about it. So it's hard for me to know whether it has been actually accepted. We had Putin from the other side of the coin saying that his action has been mere frontier incidents to protect himself. So, but the discussion is not complete. So if anyone here has an idea for a frontier incident which a state considered to be an armed attack and therefore thought she is entitled to act in self-defense, that will be very much helpful. But other than that, thank you.
The floor is open, God.
So I'm sorry to return to the issue of damage,
Yeah.
but so issues like damage, intensity, and frequency,
Yeah.
would it change your mind from one event to another event? The other question, I mean, if you relate to the Arab-Israeli conflict, it's actually, you mean now the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
But we have Lebanon.
Yeah, but still it's kind of, well, maybe less so the Hezbollah, more the Hamas, it's very much asymmetrical conflict,
Yeah.
right? So the question is, do you think that from an international law perspective, an asymmetrical conflict should apply different criteria than a usual warfare? And my last question is, it would be about artillery exchange between militaries. Let's say the war of attrition in between 1968 and 1970, you know, it also was involving air bombardments, artillery exchange of fire. To me, it seems a clear case which constitute a right to self-defense. I mean, for the Egyptians against the Israelis and for the Israelis against the Egyptians.
It was the border incident.
Oh, for sure. The war of attrition, all of it was around the Suez Canal.
Alongside.
Nobody says it constitutes an armed conflict already.
Okay,
Going,
so you
ongoing
define it as a
armed
warfare.
conflict.
Exactly. You're not in
Okay.
that. I don't think it's a situation where you have a
It's not
border
an incident.
incident and you have to start thinking whether you have the right to start an armed conflict.
Actually, the Fidayun in the 50s is a much better example.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
By the way,
yeah.
Yeah.
Which included
Maybe
the
I need
Be'er
a-
or Amir
inquiry.
there and
Someone has all rights. Yes. And your first question, I
was
think.
a frequency
And
and
also the
intensity.
application wasn't the same, so it's a
Yeah.
bit stronger.
So and damage.
And
So I
damage.
think the frequency goes inside the accumulation. I think it's I didn't get into it, but it's part
Okay.
of the formulation of the accumulation of events. When you talk about damage, now damage is tricky because, for example, many states in their many states in their military manuals say specifically that accidental bombing, while it can cause major damage, will not be an armed attack. And that, I think, relates to intention, why they don't say so explicitly. So damage is tricky, but damage will go under the scale and effects. So it will be checked just at the second stage.
Okay.
And what was the other one? We had intensity,
So frequency.
frequency inside the accumulation.
Okay. Thanks.
So let me follow Gadi. I think that you can be a great advocate of the Israeli government position.
I hope not.
But I have a problem with the analytical structure of your argument, because you say, you know, most of the things are about Gaza, Israel.
Yeah.
And you say, let's assume that it is an international border, two states.
Well,
and
I'm not
apply.
assuming there are two states.
Okay, but let's assume that
There's no
the
close
whole,
border, there's a free
it's an international conflict between two entities, and therefore the whole apparatus of Article 50 and Article 51 come into force.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of complexity vis-à-vis Gaza and the classification of the actual incidents is contingent on the fact that Gaza is not a sovereign state, that although we say that we withdrew from Gaza, we actually control Gaza. So all these actually affect the nature of these incidents, and therefore you cannot really analyze them separately from the question of whether this is a border at all.
No, you're absolutely
So,
right.
so I think, if you go, the same incidents that happens in the Gaza border, if they happen in the Israeli-Syria border, which is an established international border recognized by everyone, sorry, recognized because of the armistice agreement, the same kind of, let's say that there is one tunnel, not many tunnels between Syria and Israel. This is, quite clearly an armed attack, and
Well,
I
we
would
have
say that
found-
there would be a consensus.
We have found tunnels between Israel and Lebanon, right?
Yes, of
Yeah.
course.
We didn't
So-
consider it to
so
be an
maybe
armed
that
attack.
So I
But we
think,
could have.
I don't know if we could have, because I think they weren't enough, to be honest.
No, there were.
no, there is enough.
Not
It's
in
sufficient that there is
Gaza,
one
but
tunnel.
with all the-
Yeah,
that,
that's true too.
So, that doesn't say that Israel's all interest every time is to retaliate
Of
or
course.
to launch self-defense. But from an international perspective, a tunnel that is constructed by militants and not by smugglers, even if there is one tunnel, will probably constitute a right to self-defense. And all this is not applicable to Gaza because of the first question that you assume,
No.
as a
No, that's a problem I'm aware of. I know the fact that all of the three of the examples are in Gaza. It's very much problematic. If I had other examples, I would have used them. To be honest, because I think that the minute you read about this, the assumptions weren't meant to make a legal argument. I mean, of course, they can be attacked, and there are different opinions. And to be honest, it's another article. You can write an entire article about it. So I just wanted to keep the discussion running. Now, of course, it would have been much better if I would find a more stable, sort of easier surroundings to work with. But these are the examples that I have, and by the means, as I explained, that it's a very active frontier, and we have a lot of things going on there. We have a will to act and to say that we have a right to self-defense and attack, and that the international community has something to say about it. If you will look about what happened between us and Lebanon and the tunnels there's not really discussion about it. Like, there's not much
because
to
there was
work
an
with.
agreement that if there is a military tunnel from Lebanon to Israel, it is a cause for self-defense. So there was no really dispute about it, and the dispute about Gaza is not because of the nature of the incidents, but because of
The nature of the conflict.
the nature of the conflict, or whether
nature
it's
of the
a
border.
Nature of
Yeah,
the
the border.
situation.
Yeah, but I do think that that whether it's a border, or if you consider Gaza to be state or occupied or non-state, or there's a great discussion about it clearly. But the first step, where you sort of have to see whether it was an armed attack, I don't think you have to decide about it yet, because you can have an armed attack carried by either a state or a non-state. And that's what I try to explain, but maybe I wasn't clear enough. You have the armed attack, the incident itself. You have to see if it was an armed attack or just an aggression. And then on this next stage,
the Israeli-Arab riots of 2000
yeah,
within Israel.
yeah,
Nobody will talk about it in the framework of an armed attack, right?
Of course.
It's a policing
course.
issue, it's
Yeah.
an internal issue.
yeah.
And of course, if you relate to Gaza as either part of Israel or the occupied territory, it changes the framework altogether.
No, I agree with you. I consider it a weakness of the research as well.
To some extent, though, because laws of occupation are still under the laws of armed conflict. So the entire framework of occupation is managed by the military forces. So it's not the same as within your own territory, law enforcement, regular situation. It's still an external humanitarian law situation rather than an internal
Humanitarian law
attack.
situation is nothing to do with armed attack.
Yeah, yes, it does. armed attack is what initiate. First of all, occupation is part of humanitarian law, and armed attack is what initiates humanitarian law.
With regarding to occupation law, you're completely right. But if you look at Israel's position that there is a continuous armed conflict, then the discussion of jus ad bellum becomes quite redundant. So
yeah, but then we go into what is an armed attack within in bello and not what is an armed attack ad bellum, which changes completely the discourse.
Of course, we're in the ad bellum here.
So you can't say with the in bello an ongoing armed attack and go ad
bellum. This is
what
I'm saying. I think that the point stands. I think it is a weakness of the research which you have to find a way to deal with.
Yeah, but not necessarily the internal external thing.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so I like a lot the attempt to define an armed attack, and I think you have something here. I want to try to take you up on your challenge, and let's assume that we're in Korea. So when you go to South Korea, I've never been to North Korea for obvious reasons, but when you go to South Korea, yes. When you go to South Korea, part of spiel that you go to when you go to the zone, to the DMZ, is that they take you to the tunnels.
Okay.
The tunnels that the North Koreans dug, and they have a whole. It's quite amazing. They have a whole audiovisual event there. You go there, and they make explosives, make sounds of explosions, as if the tunnel is going to strike you any minute. It's a tunnel that was 3 of them that were dug. You see the tunnels, but when you go there, the audiovisual effect is that things are exploding all the time.
Yeah. Because
from their perspective, it's not just an act of aggression. That was an armed attack. Now they didn't retaliate because they think that they had the right to do that, but had they retaliated in South Korea versus North Korea, we know how it starts, how it ends, and where it ends geographically is. So I think you're right that the notion of purpose and the notion so whether it's a purposeful act of aggression, and the notion here is you can't. I think you need to. The starting point is that there is aggression. So you take it for granted because you say, oh, there has to be more than aggression, right? Yeah. An armed attack has to be. But I think it would be helpful if you'll say there has to be an aggressive, a character of aggression and a purpose of aggression, which takes away the tunnels under the U.S.-Mexican border, takes away, a lot of stuff because you have to start from aggression, number one. Number two, I think that and that's a methodological point. I think what Eli was perhaps trying to get at is you are looking for a universal definition.
Yeah.
Something that applies, that's how public international law works. That's the beauty of it, right? It has to apply to Guatemala, and if there's a struggle with the tigers in this and whatever, it has to apply there. The question, though, is to what extent regional dimensions here play a role, because the notion of what is perceived to be an armed attack by the country attacked, that may differ. So it could be situations where you say, oh, it's terrible, somebody took a shoe and stepped in my territory, that's terrible, that my honor, my national honor has been harmed, that's a cause for retaliation, that's an armed attack, how can you not see it? Whereas in other situations, people will say, come on, it's just, so a tunnel went under you, as long as they don't use it, it's just a potential for armed attack, nothing happened, no bullet was fired, nothing, so you can talk about trespass to your sovereignty, that's a different matter. But an attack hasn't happened yet, nobody fired any bullets, so just the fact that there's infiltration of the tunnel under you, that's not an armed attack, and there's a cultural dimension here. That's all. Number 3, and this is where I conclude, I want to challenge you with this notion, what is a frontier?
Okay.
Because you're so geographically situated that it is refreshing, almost in our day and age, that you send us back to an era where geography matters. Why? Because what is the frontier? There is a missile attack that goes all the way and doesn't. It's not a frontier or there's a cyber attack. Cyber attack is not related to any frontier. Like what is that? Do we have to constrain ourselves to a certain area we call the frontier, or we're all living in a frontier of some sort, any time, any place? Or does it change according to
Expanding frontiers.
whatever something happens?
Well, the last question is very interesting, and we'll have to think about it. I didn't even give it a thought, to be honest, so I will have to think about it. But what is, and it's funny because there's a lot of writing about cyber attacks and frontier incidents, so
Well,
very interesting point.
There's another example of that, and that's when the Iranians were trying to enrich uranium, and suddenly the computers didn't work.
Yeah.
And in fact, the centrifuges blew up.
Suddenly.
Yeah.
Yes,
Something happened.
sort of. Right? The stuck.
But there was no purpose. It was just an accident.
Of course. It was clearly accidental. And the second thing, or the cultural differences, so that's very interesting, because like when I talk about the kidnapping of a soldier, the United States doesn't make half the public debate it makes in Israel. So, but I think that goes into the complexity of the events, because it has some kind of subjective element to it. If it sends your state into a spiral, if the public debate is dominated by this topic, if you think about military operations to rescue those soldiers, it is a complex event for you. Maybe it wouldn't have been for another state, I agree with you completely. So, but you can say it about international law in general. We get that a lot about proportionality. That the way we view proportionality and the value of lives from each side just doesn't match the way other states view proportionality.
Right.
So that's always right in international law. And the first thing, regarding the requirement of aggression. So I think that's another thing I kind of took for granted, right? There has to be an aggression. But I did address it with the military character of events. Because, if, like you said, if you have a smuggling tunnel, it's not the same as a combat tunnel, and that is because that is of a military character. So I think I put it there, but maybe it should be first. Maybe that's
You have to, the starting point should be aggression.
exactly.
If it's not even aggression, then
Because I think that maybe someone digging a tunnel into your state, it is an act of aggression, right? Even if
Right.
the intention is not military. But what makes it an armed attack, it's for the function of using it as a combat tunnel. So I'm thinking maybe it just should go first, because that's the starting point, really. So thank you. Really helpful.
So it's context, and it's not just culture, but it's context matters.
Exactly.
Because the cultures
Exactly.
may differ, but it's that context matters.
Yeah, that's true.
But this is exactly the opposite of the purpose of international law.
Yes, it is. But then you have regional agreement.
Zacharias.
Zachariah will speak in Arabic. No, I will speak in English. I think the problem is that the charter, the UN Charter from October 1945, wasn't amended yet. And we are stick to the 2.24 and 51, and we cannot go back to these clauses because everything
But it is
changed.
customary, though.
It's customary, yeah, but you know, we are talking about, just to give you an example, the shooting of missiles or rockets
Yeah,
to Israel by the Hamas is for sure an arm attack.
of course.
With frontier, leave aside frontier. This is so clear. And Israel has the right of self-defense. So, coming back to the frontier, it doesn't matter if there is or isn't. But there is a frontier. And Israel withdraw to the frontier. Hamas has no question about the frontier that is between Gaza Strip and Israel. This is the frontier. But the problem is not the frontier. The problem is the context. The problem is the intention. The problem is the conduct. When you are shooting rockets, I'm amazed that we are talking about if it's, a frontier incident or an arm attack. It's for sure an arm
No,
attack.
but shooting of rocket is not a frontier incident.
No. You have mentioned that we have a complexity with the Gaza Strip.
Yeah.
There is no complexity.
Oh, do you see the
There is a complexity with the march to return, maybe, because it's a mixture of civilians and Hamas or jihad, whatever.
I think that if you
But it's
put-
an arm attack for sure.
If you'll put a group of international lawyers in a room and ask them what the status of the conflict between Israel and Gaza, you'll have a million different
I know,
answers.
but it doesn't matter for me because I know what is the truth from my perspective. From my perspective, because Israel, what they are saying,
these lawyers or scholars, that Israel is controlling Gaza, and that's why, or we have an embargo on Gaza, and that's why it's not a simple thing that we have withdrawn. But the fact is the other way. We have put this control and embargo because the conduct of Hamas.
But the thing is that I don't want to even start the conversation.
So the question is, from where do you start?
I don't want to start the conversation just because it's not the topic of the article. As I said, that it deserves a book. I mean, you know, I can't write a research about frontier incidents and deal with the status of Gaza. Therefore, I would be very, very grateful if I had something else to show as an example.
The shooting in Sarajevo.
I will look up for it.
No, they shot what started the first, which started the First World War.
Yeah. The Prince Barth, yeah, Ferdinand.
The murder of.
But what is a frontier incident,
It's
though?
not a frontier.
Was it?
I don't
Yeah,
think it's
but
frontier
was it? But
incident.
assume that it happened on the frontier. Just for the sake of,
So
if you
for the
can
march
assume,
for the march
just
of
one
return,
sniper, boom. Is this an armed attack?
for the march of return, because things are so complicated there, I wrote in the end, I don't even know if I will leave it like that. I thought, like, disregard all the circumstances. Imagine there's the state of Arcadia and the state of Ethiopia. This one is, I mean, you sort of have to simplify it to make a good example out of it. It is complicated. I disagree. I think it's it's very much complicated. But if I will start having this discussion, I think the result will be what happens now. We're talking about the conflict rather than about armed attacks as frontier incidents. So
there is a logical,
distracting.
there is a logical problem here. I'll tell you why. The test of scale and effects. Take the tunnels. We don't have to wait and see what are the effects in order to retaliate. The potential of the tunnel. This is the main thing. The potential of the tunnel. By the way, a combat tunnel can be switched very, very quickly. A smuggling tunnel can be switched very quickly. There is no ticket saying this is this and this is
the United
this.
States has a right of self-defense versus Mexico.
If Mexico were going to invade, which
Yeah.
is not
Of course.
I mean, but that's
Of
just so
course.
not going to happen. But it might be helpful to think of places in the world where there are frontier disputes going. I'm thinking of India and Kashmir and Pakistan. I'm thinking of, it's not a great number because
Kashmir is a
borders
wonderful
are
thing.
Yes.
fairly stable, but you could probably collect a list of 4 or 5 over the last 30 or 40 years that might get you beyond.
there's no-
some.
So
But
I
there's
have a
no
list like that,
debate
but there's
afterwards.
exactly that's
Right.
my problem. So I have a list like this of states that have claimed frontier incidents, and Pakistan and India is
In the
mentioned
Kashmir
there.
areas.
There
as
is a full data set about it, incidentally, by at Michigan and Arbor in the ISPS Institute. It was a big project, subsidized at first by the CIA in the 50s, and later on became a more purely research project conducted by David Singer from University of Michigan and Arbor. So there is a full data set with all border incidents and warfare quotations. All you can
So I
access
wanna-
it.
Can you repeat just the
Yeah,
source
it's
itself?
it was under the name of David Singer. He's not with us anymore, so I guess now we are talking about other scholars at Michigan and Arbor in the ISPSR Institute, which is a kind of applied social science institute.
Thank you.
Look into it.
But yeah, I have looked deeply into India and Pakistan because I thought too that it will be like a good place to start looking, and also with Russia and Ukraine, and
Sure.
I think
It's just that Russia won.
I'm missing of enough debate to sort of make something out of it. So I say they have claimed that the frontier incident has been an armed attack, but then I don't have statements by state, by officials. I don't have the debate afterwards, so it's quite flat. I do use it though. I didn't come across in the presentation, but it is in the research. But yeah, maybe something will come up.
Okay.
Okay. First of all, thank you for a very good article. But my point, there are smaller points. The first one is I want to join the issue with the tent, and maybe you should look for a different name for that because I'm sure, as Nasrallah has said, his intent was not to start a war at that time. So, but it's not the intention to go on a war or something like that. It's like the nature of the act. Is it criminal or was it aggression? So
and also not that too, but also whether it was intentional in the means that.
I'm just saying the word maybe find something which is more like the nature of the act or something, or which is something more. That's a smaller issue. I've talked about things earlier. My main point, and that's it. There is a Hebrew saying that when you throw a stone, if someone throws a stone, 100 wise men cannot pull it out. And this is what I think happened with the frontier incident as a whole. Because I was reading again, after talking with you, the Nicaragua judgment here, and saying...
You can interpret it quite differently, right?
Yeah, but the issue is like this. The court just wanted to say that there are armed attacks, there are smaller things, that not everything constitutes an armed attack, like mere frontier incidents, that was the word. And from that on, and no one ever thought, I think, at that point, that there is a different scale from here to a frontier attack and from a frontier attack to a full-scale armed attack, okay? It's the same one all over. This is why all your questions are relevant also for the other part of when it's an armed attack, and this is why, like Gadi was asking about the damage, is also relevant from the beginning, from the whether it goes to it's the same scale all over again. That's the paradigm that I would have written an article about. Here is something that someone once said about there's only frontier incidents we are very small nature and not constitute an armed attack. We're now having a whole new tests, legal questions about what is a frontier incident. And of course there's nothing in it in international law because no one before the Nicaragua gave that example. So from my perspective, my idea for all your questions...
It's just a mistake.
It's not a mistake. It was something deliberate said about it. There was logic into it. Not to, the court didn't want everything go to be an armed attack, and gave something like not every maybe it began maybe an example. Maybe he did want to say okay, just a frontier attack, but the idea to say there's a whole body of tests or legal understanding that brings you from the incident brings you to whether it's just an incident, and then from that came to an armed attack. That is the problem that I see in the whole paradigm. The whole paradigm is wrong here, is the way I think it. Everything that you see, you look at afterwards is relevant from the beginning, and everything you so looked at in the beginning is relevant also afterwards. So it's the same scale all over again. So I don't argue with you about this is what has become of it. Okay,
yeah.
Your starting point, and you state that. There's argument going on that, but I'm getting out from that point that there is that borderline that's between an incident and then an armed attack, and I'm not arguing with it, but I'm raising the question whether the whole paradigm that we've gone into is the correct one, because I don't see the difference. If the incident would have been one person shooting, and then there's another person shooting, and there's a whole 3 people and 5 people and 10 people, at some point, you will say, "Oh, that's too much that's too much," and it's not a different scale.
But
it's the same one.
As of now, what you have is it doesn't matter if one person was shooting or 10. The law in the books is state's practice shows us otherwise. But it doesn't matter if one person shoots across the border or 10, it's a border incident, and therefore it will not go under the
No, but if you have a brigade shooting together, then you already what I'm saying, at one point it will go to...
I agree with you on the instinctive level, I agree. But what the dry
it's an analytical level, not on the instinctive one that bothers me.
I agree with you, but many other scholars have said, what are you talking about? The ICJ is wrong, and we should just take every frontier incident and judge it under the scale and effects test. I mean, you're in the inclusion camp we're talking about inclusion exclusion, right?
I'm not.
You're
I'm
saying
saying it was the same. I'm just saying what I'm saying. It's the same scale.
But it's
I
not the
wouldn't
same
put
scale,
me in
and
any camp because I know they have different reasons. By the way, some of the answers that were given for that, once it was said, and again everybody tried to explain why it's so important to have a frontier incidents. For example, we don't want as a policy to go too far, but it would be the same to have the same scale and raise the level of the intensity out of policy.
So I'll explain. It's not the same level. I think that what you're suggesting is that my scale is identical to that of the scale of effects, right? That's what you're saying?
What I'm saying that your questions are good for the scales and effect, because if someone is lacking for the intention, for example, that will be also relevant on the other side, and the scale and effect in a way is inherent in the question whether it is
if you look closely into the scale and effect test and how it's applied, so these are different questions that we ask here.
No,
right?
I know. This is what I'm saying.
But you say that I can just improve the existing scale and effect test.
What I would suggest, okay, within the academia, okay, and again, I'm saying your point of exit to this article is, I don't contending it's right. It's you're going in the article from the right point of view. This is law today. Okay, this is how, not exactly the Eritrean commission. They have the terrible things said on other aspects. I wouldn't say that everything that bombing a power station which is not even completed is okay for political reasons. Is the correct targeting law? Okay, it's not something that I will take everything that the commission has said as granted. But what I'm saying, we should, if we are in academia, we should have looked at it from start to beginning as a whole, whether we've gone into a strange paradigm that is divided by not realistic even points that it's different to say where they are. So trying to implement.
Don't go on paradigm weird.
No, it's
actually I would like to take
just a second.
Sorry.
No, if it's
No, just the same question, but just to maybe to sharpen what Robert is saying.
I need sharpening all the time.
No. So I think that because following what he says, there is a question of a legal paradigm. I mean, why not just to say that Article 51 refers to existential threat to a nation state, whether it's a border event or another type of event. So if you have a sniper shooting, let's say a Palestinian sniper shooting on an Israeli soldier during the Hakel Auda marches along the border with Gaza, it's not constituted an existential threat. So you don't. How can you apply Article 51?
But Article 51 doesn't apply only to existential threat.
No, but you can interpret it. This is what it's saying.
No, it doesn't have to be.
And I don't think that states would accept it. That's for sure.
No, of course.
Because the right to self-defense, it exists way before the Charter does. It's an inherent right. The Charter describes it, doesn't grant it.
Yeah,
you understand? Customary law. I don't think you can make it as narrow. I don't think the states would accept it.
Yeah. And the outcome would be that any attack against the U.S. will never be an attack.
Which might not be a bad idea, but...
okay, so I think right now there are two main tensions in the article. The first tension is between the need to arrive at some universal rule for determining when a frontier incident is an armed conflict, and between this universal rule and the local circumstances, which I think you already brought up, Eli brought up. The Gaza-Israeli conflict isn't a strong enough example. There are lots of problems there. Yeah. So that's one tension. And the other tension, I think, is between sort of the theoretical or normative argument, which I personally think is quite strong, and the sort of descriptive argument of it all. It seems important to you to give examples that are well known, that are debated, where there was already some recognition of this idea that a frontier, something that happened on a frontier can be an armed conflict. And personally, I don't think that's that important. I think that the normative, theoretical argument of, of when a frontier incident should be armed conflict, I think it's much more important than the question of whether or not the world has recognized certain instances, like Israel with Lebanon, that it is in armed conflict. The important thing here is that you can convincingly make the case that it should be considered an armed conflict, even if the world, hasn't debated this particular example or doesn't see it this way.
That's interesting.
Okay, so I want to try to make a constructive suggestion to that end, and I think basically my suggestion is that it would be better to emphasize the sort of universal or normative aspect of the article at the expense of the more sort of local and descriptive part of the article. And I think the way to do that is, for me, analytically, it would be better to start with the theoretical universal argument and then go to the examples. Because right now the examples aren't strong enough to support the argument, and then it could be easily argued against you that it would be a sort of hard cases make bad law situation. I mean, let's not take the Israeli-Gaza conflict, which is one of the most complex conflicts, and abnormal conflicts in the world, and try to derive a universal rule from that conflict. Let's try to think first of the universal rule, and then try to apply it to Israel and Gaza and maybe to other examples. So that's my first suggestion. And the second suggestion would be to diversify the examples, and I think that once you get over this idea that it has to be an incident that was already recognized by the literature, I think that once you do that, then you already heard here that there are lots of examples that are available to you. It could be Russia and Ukraine, it could be Bosnia, it could be lots of examples that show why it could be problematic in every case to treat a frontier issue as though it's not an armed conflict. And then you can also give examples from Gaza, but the argument would be sort of the other way around. Instead of saying, look, the Gaza conflict shows that we need this universal rule, it would be, look, this universal rule that I'm suggesting could be applied to this very complex situation that shows us why it's hard to distinguish in every case between the frontier and an armed conflict.
Very interesting.
Okay, so I hope that was
very helpful, actually.
Okay.
Thank you. We started by actually had that point written here about the theoretical cases. I mean, you can actually take any case anywhere and say, well, that was an armed attack, even though they didn't relate to it or that, or publicly, or didn't relate to that publicly. They could have related that as under your analysis as an armed attack. So,
wait. I have a follow-up question on this. Are you sure about the fact that I see the point that an armed attack is something unique, and therefore the lack of recognition as such, in and of itself, has some normative. So I wouldn't just. I mean, sometimes it's tempting to say, "Oh, the world just didn't see this, didn't notice that there are all these armed attacks going on." It could be because the world took it for granted that clearly it's an armed attack, or because the world didn't see it as an armed attack. But the role of practice, a more theoretical level, the role of practice and how the world reacts to something is part of the context. And if it is that, then we can't delegalize it. We can't just say, "Oh, they didn't recognize it."
No, I agree that it strengthens the argument. I mean, if you can show, for instance, in the case of Lebanon, here even the other organizations in the world recognize this, then I agree that it does strengthen it. But I'm not sure that it should be a sort of preliminary demand for including.
My whole point is it's an analytical question whether we wouldn't necessarily say that clearly state recognition didn't. There are categories in international law where the reaction of other states is constitutive of the category.
Of course.
And then therefore the question is whether an armed attack is one of those categories where if you don't have any state recognition of an armed attack, and there's a normative claim for that. Why? Because you don't want states to say, "Oh, this is an armed attack and I have the right to see it as an armed attack," and therefore the whole point of the article is to say, no, it's not a fully subjective decision of the state. There has to be some normative general criteria. And the question whether recognition is part or not part of it is question.
So let me take you.
Maybe recognition
I want to just add to.
Let Ido finish his point.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
So within that, before I actually go to my point, because I'm still on Rotom's point, and I'm gonna follow up on our conversation that we had last week. it has also the other way around. Sometimes states argue we have the self-defense even though they are already within an in bello situation. Jus ad bellum is completed. The argument of self-defense is not legally relevant,
They don't need it.
but it's a statement that they made. So statements can be both here and
That's
there.
right.
And actually, I would also, in the notion of statement of Pakistan and India especially, I would go to see statements in the Human Rights Council, where they are very, very active and loud and talking about their clashes all the time, and it doesn't really get to public awareness that much.
I actually have looked at it. I have to.
Okay, now,
Yeah, sorry.
to my main point, what happens if we're talking about on the border,
Yeah.
but not between state A and B, but rather state C is fighting on conflict. U.S. is out fighting on conflict in Afghanistan,
Fire steel?
and they are being shot at by a different actor, by a third actor, across the border towards so if they retaliate, it's an act against that state or within that state.
So
So,
wait,
there is a
yeah.
border there.
Again,
We have state A
state A,
having a conflict in state B.
in state B, and they don't have a shared border.
No, that's the U.S. It's all
yeah,
That's the
far,
global
far
dimension.
away.
That's the
Okay.
global dimension. Yeah.
Now, from state C, I'm not saying state C, but from state C, like either an armed group or the state.
Very interesting. That relates to what's a border and to
Yeah,
who
what's
does
a
it relate. Very
This is
interesting.
Cambodia and Vietnam. And
You
This
have-
is Israel, Hamas, and the Jihad. It's the same.
That's the entire Cold War, actually.
Cold War. Yeah.
The
Yeah.
entire
Yeah.
Cold War
So I'm
is
taking
Yeah.
Cold War like the
But you
Vietnam
can say
War.
maybe it's an undertext, but that there's a question whether it's a frontier incident. That's
That's
an
right.
Yeah.
interesting question.
Because
Yeah,
there's no frontier between the U.S. and any of
Right.
them.
exactly. Does it have to be just a frontier? Or
Yeah.
and
But
last
yeah, it's interesting.
short comment. I'm going to refer to the notion of aggression. On that, I would go straightly to the ICC Rome Statute definition of what
Yeah,
is an
I
act of
have
aggression,
the,
and then comply it with what is constituted an act of aggression, and then
My
see on
starting
the attack
point
versus
was
an
that
act of aggression.
there is an act of aggression. And that's a mistake because you have to start from ground up. So yeah, definitely. And your first point. Oh, and regarding the Israeli example. So when I wrote this article, when I started writing, I did have the feeling that if I have to prove something like there are untraditional frontier incidents or they do give rise to self-defense claim, I do have to prove it, just like Alan said. But also for the defense of the Israeli examples, I can say that I think everybody are familiar here with the specially affected states doctrine. So Israel can be viewed as a specially affected state in that, like in the frontier incident field, because it has confronted a lot of frontier incidents which did give rise to claims of self-defense. So actually Israel's positions and actions are especially telling in this specific arena that could be
But you do have the entire noise of an ongoing armed conflict, which undermines
the noise exists.
Yeah.
Of course. Nevertheless, that's something like to say in favor of using it. I am looking for other examples.
For sale.
Yeah.
So, first of all, it's fascinating paper, fascinating discussion. A slight paradigm challenge from a non-lawyer. So when I first when you first started talking about frontiers, and as picking up
Geographers
on,
know something about frontiers.
except I'm not a geographer, but yes.
But
But
geographers
picking
do.
up on Amnon and Rotem, and there's the tension between the global and the local, and the universal. You're looking for universal examples and the context, and somehow, and I have Ido sitting here saying, yeah, but international law, it has to apply to everything. Can frontier incidents be looked at universally, or do they have to have a context-based frame? And if they do have a context-based frame, then looking for, universal examples from all over the place, maybe you don't have to. I mean, maybe you actually have to look at context. And then, Amnon started talking about state-based, which I don't know enough about. But I mean, I'm just challenging the overall paradigm.
So that's an interesting
You are
point.
challenging law.
Yeah.
No,
Well,
actually, there was
Not
such a
necessarily,
discussion.
though, but yes.
The law
in a
should be
way.
amended from time
Yeah.
to time.
Listen, there was such a discussion, not in this context exactly, but when
The law
youth
should
in
be
Bellum.
amended from time to time.
The-
Shall be adopted from time
I
to
think
time.
there's a good
October
law.
1945.
No, no,
51.
the law is good.
51.
It has to be interpreted in according to the relevance of the situation. Anyways, there was such a discussion going between an American professor, Mike Schmidt, and John Miriam wrote, a person who wrote an article about the Israeli conduct of the 2014 operation. And on the other side, Yuval Shani and Michai Cohen from here, going out to a discussion whether the Israeli mentality and sensitivity to human lives and history of traumas should affect the way that Israel is conducting the test of proportionality.
Yeah, as I said before, they always make this claim regarding to proportionality.
And that's while Mike Schmidt, the American, saying it's understandable, and the Israeli guy saying that what Eli was saying, that we can't have international law localized every time because therefore we cannot have something which is common to everybody.
True. But in the context of frontiers, if you're still thinking of the frontier as a geographical entity, which it no longer is, I mean, you know, we have frontiers on many, many scales.
No, this is why I agree the cyber example is great to say that it was always at one scale and one point, just put with an example that was typical of the time. This is what that brings me from this is why it's okay, but
it's a social dimension. There is a social dimension.
The cyber example is not relevant because there is an article about armed attack, and in this sense, the question is whether a cyber attack is an armed attack. And there is a special article about frontier borders.
No, not exactly.
Right?
The idea, the law only states speaks about armed attack. The frontier example was something that the ICJ wrote in the Nicaragua judgment.
There's something below armed attack.
So there was a whole discussion about it in cyber law, and because there are things that you can do. That's interesting. If it's not only an armed attack, you can have countermeasures.
That's the thing, the
that's the big discussion about cyber operations, which not constitute an armed attack, but most of them are done in that domain.
Okay, sorry. I have another question though, just to understand your intuition better. You go back to Gaza. Let's just talk about Gaza.
Let's talk about Gaza.
What's fun?
So Gaza, I take it, and that's a question. There's a question here that in your mind is there a difference between a tunnel that crosses the border and a tunnel that doesn't cross the border?
Yeah.
So let's assume that you have an offensive tunnel that stops right on the border, but its entire purpose is offensive. There's no defensive element. You see the structure of the tunnel, it's offensive. Can Israel say, well, maybe one of those I can overlook, but if there are 12 of these, the moment you build the 13th, that's it. Whatever.
That's a question of preemptive self-defense, right?
So to the extent I need preemptive self-defense, it's easier for me. It's not necessary for me because I can also trigger something like accumulation of border incidents to say the needle pricking doctrine of self-defense against those tiny little things. But to the extent I want to say no, it's an armed attack. No.
I don't think that you can. I don't think you can. I think you can look at it through the lenses of preemptive self-defense, but I think that the moment it will become something that is worth considering as an armed attack, it has to cross the border.
But so suppose
because
it crosses
right now
the border,
it's on your side of the border, right? It's not a border incident.
So suppose Lebanon crossed the border Lebanon crossed the border to Israel.
Yeah.
several meters, not cross the border to Israel. So, from your perspective, as soon as it crossed the border, it's an armed attack.
Well,
they're crossing
not
to occupied
necessarily.
Golan?
Not
No, not
necessarily.
Golan.
It's an
No, not
aggression.
Golan.
No, the minute it's crossed the border, it's an aggression. Now you have to consider whether it's
No, the scale is there. Let's assume that the scale is there.
Everything
the purpose
is there.
Everything is
everything is there.
there. And it was discovered 3 years later. No effect at all. It was dormant. Nobody knew about it. It didn't have any effect. No effect. Can we consider of an armed attack with zero effect? That's my point, right?
Well, you just said what you called what happened in Gaza, Lebanon, right? Because we discovered them quite late. There was no effect by then, but we were scared by the.
We're scared. That's a risk.
Yeah.
So
It's perception.
Well, the tunnels there
Yes, you
were in Israel.
no.
Yeah,
the
they were
tunnel is
inside.
there. So this is what I'm saying. I moved it. So I'm
Yeah.
saying they crossed the border. So I'm saying there has to be some maybe. And that's just this notion of risk. Because under your binary yes/no understanding,
Yeah.
maybe you can. And I think it's there under complexity or something. But I think a better definition of what the risk is would help, because tunnels, undetected tunnels that are there, it could be millions of them, etc. It could be tens of them, but nobody uses them. They're just there, and then can you actually say, "Oh, I'm being harmed. There's an armed attack
And
against
if
me."
there's,
But
if
that's
there's
where it's context,
That
because
I
it's
get it.
perception of risk.
I get it. I think you're right.
You
The
know,
social
you can't
context must be there.
define.
I'm just
you know,
trying to get it to
there's
the
no
same
definition.
thing.
There's a
different.
perception of the risk, which
Well,
may
if
vary.
you just see tunnels crossing your border, how do you know if maybe those are smuggling tunnels? You don't know anything. But when you have,
Well, that's why the
let's go back to
context
Gaza,
is
when you have
important.
officials saying there was an operation planned and all, you have to build it to be.
Right. But the perception, sometimes the act of war, it's the notion of psychological war. But
Of course.
I get it. I'm just saying that you have to. I think it might be a more
Substantial.
a better way, conceptually superior way to tie it back to the notion of risk. Why do we
Exactly.
care about this? Because it generates the type of risks
The notion of danger.
that a danger notion, the type of risks that the regime is there to allow you to respond.
But you know that there is a question whether you have a right of preemptive self-defense to begin with. That's a debate.
There is a debate, but assuming sometimes you have to assume things, right? But
So to assume there is a right of preemptive self-defense, and then
assume that the right of self-defense includes preemption, but even if you don't assume preemption, let's say that it crosses the border but you don't know about it, right? And again, I don't want to hold the conversation, but assume that you act without you think mistakenly, you think that the tunnels did not cross your border.
okay.
Turns out that you did. Assume now that they law school, right?
Yeah.
So now you attack, and there's no preemptive right. So technically, from your perspective, you're doing something wrong because it turns out that you were right. So just to get
No, that's
this
interesting.
notion of risk.
I will have to think out
Vulnerability.
In order for take your example, in order for this to be an armed attack and retaliate, the first thing is to know about it. If you don't know anything, it's not an armed attack.
Right.
It's not nothing.
Why?
It's even not a potential risk because you don't know about it.
But
You have to know.
But
You
under
have to
Shelley's-
add to this.
But under Shelley's definition, you don't have to know anything.
No.
I mean, you have to know about the purpose.
Of course you have to.
Yeah,
know.
you know that there's a purpose. No, you have to know, but you don't have to know the extent to which the tunnel
That's a
actually
problem.
infiltrates to your
Well,
tunnel.
you can only know what you know, right?
Yeah, that's
Shelley,
that's
that's
true.
Shelley,
But
Shelley,
let's assume that you justify. I'll finish here. Let's assume that you think you know, it crosses 1 meter. Turns out it crosses 100 meters.
Yeah.
1 kilometer, 2 kilometers. It doesn't make any difference under your analysis, right?
Complexity, probably.
Yeah, but
that's what they're
Just
done with.
two factual questions. First of all, what were the
Or in the
actual-
scale. When I come to think of it, I'm sorry, it's later. It's in the scale, right?
yeah, but the scale you have 10 of them, so scale satisfied.
No. Scale will be whether I think there are 100 meters or 10 meters.
But the scale can also be satisfied by having a dozen of them.
That's the accumulation.
It does the same stuff though, but it does the
Not
same work.
necessarily, because accumulation, what it means is a lot of minor
I
things.
understand, but it does the same stuff in terms of understanding what the risk is.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. Yeah.
Shelley, I think that scale is nonsense. I'll tell you why.
But scale
Because
exists.
no, it's a nonsense because this is the tunnel. This is the length of the. This is the length of the tunnel, and I can build a tunnel, one tunnel only, that I can, deliver through this tunnel trucks, tanks, artillery, you name it. So the extent, or the if it's 1 tunnel or 12 tunnel, it doesn't matter. And if you don't know about the tunnels, and you don't know the length of the tunnel and the type of the tunnel, I think it's nonsense to speak about it
Because you don't know.
as a criterion. Second, we have a problem in math, what I call the independent variable and the dependent variable. What I mean is that
It's methodology.
when you are talking about scale and effect, the effect is ex post. We know about the effect ex post. Now, if I, as a military person or an official, accommodate the mere frontier incident, accommodate it,
Yeah.
try to delimit it, and not to expand it. This by itself doesn't
Affect the scope, yeah.
exactly. This by itself, I prevent the accumulation problem, and because of this, that I prevented by policy, by discretion, etc., it doesn't, evolve to an arm attack. So the problem is a logical problem here. I don't think that we can, engage the independent variable and the dependent variable when we are talking about definition of an arm attack,
Well,
because it's very much dependent on the side that is attacked or potentially attacked. We have a logical problem. This cannot be a criterion.
but the scales and effect,
And just to conclude,
I cannot. It's not my test. It's a test set by the ICJ.
I
The
know.
United States agree
I
with you, by the
know,
way.
I
They
know,
see it
it's
the same
not,
way you
it's
do.
not, it's not a critic on you, I know.
No,
The
what I'm
second-
saying is I don't want in this research, maybe that's a valuable criticism and go right about it, really, it's interesting. But in this research I wanted to concentrate on offering sort of a way to resolve the frontier incidence issue, and I don't want to start arguing with the ICJ regarding the scales and
No,
scale
okay,
and
but it
effect.
doesn't suffice, because accumulation, as a criterion, if I control it
Yeah,
ex ante,
but you can't always, right?
no, of course, I accommodate the incident. I don't want it to be, a
But-
bigger
but
one.
Zechariah, this is always the case when you
No, but-
exercise self-defense, even when it's a very, very clear case that you are no controversy that you have the right to self-defense. Exercising the right affect the scope and the deterioration of the situation.
Question is whether you
So-
have to begin
No,
with
no,
the
but
initial.
the problem is the definition of an arm attack,
Yeah.
that afterwards we are coming to the question of self-defense, or preemptive self.
Yeah, but your response always, is the most important
No, but
factor.
the
that affects
criterion,
it.
as I understand the criterion, it's an ex post criterion. First of all, we have the incident. Then we are judging the scale of it, and thereafter we are judging the effect of it, and then we are deciding. What I'm saying is that this decision by itself, if I'm reverting to the incident itself, if I'm controlling it, if I'm accommodating, and it doesn't evolve to an arm attack, so it makes a difference. Now, just another word before I'm forgetting. You are saying that Gaza is a complex thing. Let's take an example that the civilians will penetrate Israel, will succeed in,
That's
March.
actively.
yeah,
That's actively.
and they are
participating
coming
in hostilities, I
into
guess.
the kibbutzim
It happens.
in the envelope,
Yeah.
and they are kidnapping, killing, whatever. This will be an arm attack.
Yeah, of course.
So the very fact that we are defending ourselves before this incident occurs.
That's preemptive self-defense. It's a question.
So-
yeah.
But I know, but you come from this to say that the civilian march is not an armed attack, and I'm saying that's an armed attack in potential.
I don't think it's an armed attack. No.
That's a problem.
Well,
If they penetrate, if they succeed, because I don't know, it will be an armed attack.
I think maybe it's not a legal observation, but I think that a democratic state has to take some stakes to remain democratic. You can't always assume. I mean, there are protests. There are civilian dimensions to them. I think
this is not in the 51 clause.
Well,
if it's democratic or not democratic.
No, that's what I say. It's not a legal observation now. I said so.
No,
but I think, but I think it's. I said it's not a legal observation. I think that we should be able to deal with it. Until someone has breached the fence and really tried to harm you, I don't think you can look at it as an armed attack. You can take it to the lane of preemptive self-defense and see if it qualifies. I don't think that it does, but maybe you think otherwise.
Let me ask you something from the other direction. You know, your definition might make sense if it really distinguishes between cases and other cases.
Yeah.
So, in what cases your actual definition negate the Israeli?
The March of Return. That's the final example, and it says it does not qualify to go under the scale and facts test. I think that it's too much of a civilian character. I think that there is no intention there. That it's of a mixed intention even, and I don't think it qualifies. That's actually the reason that I kept this specific example, even though it has its flaws, because I think it shows of a case that we don't go automatically with the state always. That's not the purpose of it. So just like you said.
What were the facts of the Nicaragua US, the actual facts?
Well, the actual facts was there were various questions there, but it was United States attacking Nicaragua targets in different states.
But what was the actual border?
No border.
No border. They just like Robert said. I think that they tried. I actually agree with Robert. I think that they tried to give an example. I didn't think that they
out
they
of
actually.
context of the particular case.
Yeah, they said there are frontier incidents and there are other minor ones. For example, there are armed attacks and there are minor ones such as frontier incidents. And I think just like Rob said,
so
that it spiraled out of control. It spiraled out of control. I think this was the interpretation that the international community gave to the Nicaragua judgment. I would have interpreted otherwise. I would have said that that's an example. It doesn't have like concrete
And
implications.
it's clear why they wanted to do it, to downgrade what an armed attack is, so you don't retaliate.
At the time, Somoza stepped down in Nicaragua. Somoza, the president. And there were, militias against and militias of Somoza pro-Somoza. And the United States backed the militias against.
Yeah,
and they attacked and blockaded from the air and from sea. That's the.
Have a question? Sorry.
Yeah, no, please.
No, sure.
Sorry.
Yeah, please.
No, I just first, when you started speaking about this, I thought of another example being potentially implemented in Turkey against the Kurds.
Yeah.
But I guess that as well is a preemptive self-defense or preventive. But this whole issue about the security zone, and I was wondering if that's relatable to this, and I was wondering why no one raised it.
About the what?
Why no one raised it? The question about the 10 kilometers.
30 kilometers.
She just thought about it. Maybe it could give example, but the question is if she can find the incident issues.
Yeah.
No, but that's a good point.
Turkey is raising some claims about being under attack or by, but there's no actual attacks happening.
Yeah.
It's, this is why we have the German, German government and others issuing statements and research is done saying that
yeah, we're just talking about it. I have to look into it.
It doesn't go
Frontier
into
attacks.
Article.
It's an armed attack.
Yes.
It's like Israel and Lebanon.
So I had a
82.
class last
But
semester
you're
where
right about this.
I had to
They tried
argue the
disrupt
case for
security zone against
the
Ashraf.
legality
Yeah,
of
if you remember.
preventive self-defense on the side of Turkey, which is why it was fresh in mind. And
Yeah, preemptive.
Preemptive,
Yeah,
sorry,
but
preemptive.
even if we put the preemptive stuff up, so Turkish forces, let's assume that Turkish forces suffer incidental, the question is whether intentional or not, right? And then the question of what do you mean by intent? It's another dimension here. So suppose I have high likelihood that it's going to happen, I just don't care. Do I intend? What's the purpose? It's armed, there's fire, and I say, I don't care about the Turkish. They should move. They should move 10 kilometers. If they don't want to get involved, they should move 10 kilometers away from the border. I have to clean the border all the way to the border. That means that some Turkish people will die, some Turkish soldiers will die. I don't intend to, but they will, in all likelihood.
Yeah.
Right? So this notion of zones and what counts as a zone is...
That's back to your...
Yeah.
Then you involve different kind of violations
Our
of
time
international
is
law.
up. Thank you very much, Shelly. What is our next